What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Skylar Fiction Show. I'm, of course, Skylar Fiction. Man, we got a great episode for you tonight. Our main, I got my main co-host, Dr. Josh, as always, from the Digital Hammurabi channel, sitting here with me. But this is something Dr. Josh has put a lot of effort into, a lot of research in the topic we're going to talk about tonight. And this is Skylar Fiction's Biblical Slavery episode. So we're going to try to get in as much information about biblical slavery as we can humanly possibly do. We will probably try to focus on some of the stuff that Mike Winger and I had kind of debated about when it came to slavery. But this episode is going to be a bigger picture about the many forms of slavery, indentured servitude, foreign slavery, wife slavery, the best kind of slavery, you might say, in the Old Testament of the Bible, and slaves of war and things like that. But before we even jump into this, I got to make sure Dr. Josh can introduce himself and tell us a little bit about himself and tell him where you can check the channel. Dr. Josh, say hello. Tell us a little bit about yourself tonight before we get going on this exciting adventure here.
Hey, everybody. I apologize for my voice. I'm just trying to get over some sort of a cold that's been going through our family. But I'm Dr. Joshua Bowen. And before I forget, which I will, Megan has said that I need to really plug the T-shirts that we have. We have T-shirts on Teespring. They're really cool, Sumerian and Akkadian and all kinds of other stuff. So, yeah, if she's watching, there, I did it.
Shirts are plugged.
I think if you go to our website or our channel or something, you can find the links for it anyway. But I'm part of Digital Hammurabi. My beautiful wife Megan is the other half, the better half. I think we would all agree. And we like to work. We work in the ancient Near East. I have a PhD in Assyriology, and we try to bring the ancient Near East in a palatable way to regular people that want to know about it. So I'm excited to be here and talk about slavery with Skylar. So thank you for having me.
It's always exciting to talk about slavery here on my channel. We're both kind of dying. You hear Josh's voice is not doing it well. I am not feeling it great either. But we're gonna get through this because we promised you guys that we were gonna deliver when it came to slavery, and that's what we do here on the Skylar Fiction Show. So I think we're gonna start right at the beginning, and we're gonna talk about the common form of slavery that at least the Christian wants to always stay on, right? Because this is the one that they kind of call the feel-good slavery, the feel-good slavery of their time. So, and that's basically called indentured servitude. So I think we'll get started right there. Josh is going to do a lot of talking, and I feel so bad for him now hearing his throat. I really feel bad for his voice. But we may end up having to break this into two sections, or we're going to see how things go. But Dr. Josh, I think we should start there. Let's talk a little bit about Hebrew slaves, indentured servitude, some of the rules, what's going on at those times, and take it from there.
Sure. So before I get started, I mean, I just want to make clear to everybody that, I'm not an ancient Near Eastern law scholar, right? So the late Dr. Raymond Westbrook and some of his students, and of course, there are a lot of ancient Near Eastern law scholars that are far more equipped to talk about this than I am. But I feel like I have the necessary tools to at least bring together their arguments and to talk about the complexities of the issues. There are going to be things, as Skylar and I have talked about, there are things that, we're going to walk away from this stream saying we can't come to a good resolution on it. But I can say what I think, and I'll produce the evidence that I have. And I guess my big hope tonight is to show, one, what the main what the general scholarly consensus is in some of these issues. Two, what the difficulties are, the debated passages, and what different scholars think. And then three, try to give my opinion on these things, Skylar's opinion on these things, and maybe open it up for debate or discussion later on down the road. So I guess the big thing to note is that and I've got my notes down here. So if you see me look down, that's what I'm looking at. They're basically in the Old Testament texts. There are two main codes. I use that word loosely, but you have the covenant code that deals with slavery in Exodus 21. In particular, it's part of the covenant code, and you have the Deuteronomy code, which of course is a sort of a somewhat of a repetition of it. But those are the two main codes. You also have the holiness code in Leviticus 25 that we talk about an awful lot. There's complexities in dealing with these passages, right? Not only from a linguistic standpoint and the issues of lexicography and those sorts of things, but also from their compositional and redactional history, right? So it's difficult to know, given that we don't have the originals, when exactly these were produced, under which circumstances, what was the Zitzim Leben for each of these, and so we have to kind of work within the uncertainty to some degree and the complexities of that. So I think it's important as we discuss this issue and we look at some of the differences, sometimes the tensions between these texts, that we remember that this isn't like a unified whole. That these are different texts written at different times in different circumstances. So, okay, all of that backdrop being said, there are basically two types of slavery that are talked about in the Hebrew Bible. There's very little difference between ancient Near Eastern slavery on the whole, be it in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and in Israel. You can talk about a general ancient Near Eastern legal pattern, I guess you could say. And the same holds true in the idea of the laws concerning slavery. Of course, there are distinctions between the regions, and of course, in the periods. We're not talking about. We're talking about law codes that go back, to the third millennium and down into the Old Testament period in the middle of the first millennium. And so it's not this. There's not this homogeneity on the whole, but there are very similar legal practices, I suppose you could say, throughout the period. So we can kind of speak about that generally. So there are basically two types of slaves. You have Hebrew slaves and foreign slaves. And this sort of thing was, excuse me, at least to a degree, somewhat similar in the wider ancient Near East. There was a distinction that was drawn, generally speaking, between citizens of a country, citizens of a a particular region, and those that are foreigners. Generally speaking, foreigners didn't have the same rights that the local citizenry had. And so, that sort of distinction in general is in play as well in Israel. The distinction is very specific in some of these passages. So when it comes to Hebrew slaves, they could be an Israelite could go into slavery in one of three ways. There are probably some others, but there's the most general, which is debt slavery, which is what Skylar was talking about. So they become poor. They can't, make ends meet, and so they either sell themselves or their wives or their children into slavery. They could be purchased. Often this would happen if, someone committed a crime and they couldn't repay their debt, like a thief. They could be purchased into slavery, and then, of course, you could be born into slavery. Now, Hebrew slaves always had the option, at least according to the legal text, of being redeemed. So what that means is that, let's say Skylar and I were kinsmen, we were related, and I had my section of land and I became very poor and I couldn't pay back my creditor. Well, I could sell myself into slavery, right? Now, I would not at that point be considered property, right? What I would be considered, the distinction, at least the general consensus on the distinction between people that were chattel slaves or considered property and those who were not considered property, are things like what happens when with that individual's property, for example. Does that property, is the property that or the money or whatever, the income that slave holds, is does it get transferred to the owner upon death? These are certain things that there are distinctions that are made between chattel slaves and debt slaves if they're considered property or not. So in this situation where I sell myself into slavery, and let's say I owe $10,000, at any point Skylar could come along as a kinsman redeemer, right? And he could pay the $10,000 and redeem me, right? Get me out. This wasn't the case for chattel slavery, right? This was that type of redemption was not a right. And even if I couldn't be redeemed, let's say I didn't have enough money, after 6 years, I would be released on the 7th year, right? As an Israelite slave. Or every 50th year, there was something called the year of Jubilee. And if that year fell before the 7 years, I would be released on the year of Jubilee as well. Leviticus 25 talks about Hebrew slaves that are indentured servants needed to be treated as hirelings, right? Those that are paid, and they weren't to be treated with the term that we use here, rigor or ruthlessness. They were to be.
And just so real quick,
Yeah, sure.
I'm just going to read that passage real quick to everybody because it really, I think, clarifies what we're talking about or what Josh's talking about here. So I'll start at Leviticus 25, chapter 25. It's going to start at 35. And you know what I should do? I should just pull this out and screen share while we're doing this real quick. All right. 1 second. Sorry. Should have had that ready. There we go. And then we'll go back home. But I just want everyone to be able to actually see the scripture as we are doing this. Okay. So it's going to start here at 35. And it says, if any of your fellow Israelites, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger so they can continue living among you. Do not take interest or profit from them, but fear your God so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt and gave you to the land of Canaan and to be your God. If your fellow Israelites, verse 39, become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you, and they are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants who I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. And this is where it makes that distinction when we start talking about foreign slaves. Verse 44, the next verse. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must never rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So, Doc, just a couple of things I want to just get your opinion on here. Let me stop sharing this really quickly. So one of the things I noticed initially is it says, where was the word? Oh, because he's right, Egypt. So right here at verse 42, because the Israelites are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Right? Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Then the next verse, your male and female slaves are to come from nations around you. So it seems like, and I'll get your opinion on this, that it's already kind of in a sense giving you the context, like, this isn't slavery in the real sense of the word, indentured servitude, right? Like how you're treating the Israelites, the Hebrews. But real slavery, the kind of slavery where you can treat them ruthlessly, and have much more, do much more than you could under for Israelite slaves, you could do with the foreign slaves. Like, it seems like it's being pretty clear there. Maybe some of your thoughts, and then please continue with. Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
No, you're good. Because I will keep rambling on. So I appreciate the break. So yeah, there are a couple of things in this passage that you guys talked about that I think we probably ought to try to get some clarity on. Number one, as you mentioned here, this word to rule over with severity. Let me just pull my notes up here. And we've talked about this a little bit before. But the word perech, so pei resh kaf is the Semitic root, and it has this idea of force, right? Of forced labor. It's understood as a type of forced labor. So, for example, it's used in Exodus 1:13 and 14. And the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and at all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. This is also used in Ezekiel 34:4. Those who are sickly you have not strengthened, the diseased you have not healed, the broken you have not bound up, the scattered you have not brought back, nor have you sought for the lost. But with force and severity you have dominated them. And so this is the word that's being used here. Now, the Septuagint translates this with the word makthos, which is hard or difficult labor, exertion, or hardship. And this isn't surprising, right? To rule over with severity is not surprising here, given what we see in, and let me just go there in Deuteronomy. Is it 20:21? Where it talks about.
Are you doing the rod, beating a slave with a rod thing?
No, this one's talking about the ban. It might be in chapter 20.
Let's see.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have.
No, it's okay.
Okay, so Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10.
10 through 15.
Yeah. So when you want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. And it shall come about, if it agrees to make peace with you and opens the door to you, or opens to you, then it shall be that all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor. This is the word mas, and that's what it means, right? It's forced labor. You can see it in different contexts. Actually, I thought I wrote them down somewhere, but I'll just pull it up here so you can see it, so I can see it in context. But it's the it's corvée, conscription labor. When for example, people are mustered together to get to work on the temple. This is the same word for this forced labor. In other words, it's not surprising to see that and these are, of course, these are the cities that are outside of Canaan, at least those that are not under the ban, right, that are supposed to be completely annihilated. This is sort of like the best case scenario for them, right? Israel marches out, essentially knocks on the door and says, will you surrender? If they say yes, cool, they get to be forced labor.
Mhm.
right? That's what they are. So it's not surprising, I suppose, to see um, not only here in this context, but in the wider ancient Near Eastern context, that foreigners are those that are used to perform this forced labor. But you're not supposed to do that with your fellow Israelites. And so anyway, we can come back to Deuteronomy 20 later, but that's sort of the one of the distinctions that I think we need to draw here, which I think you were alluding to. The other thing is this idea of property. And I remember you guys,
And there was one, just real quick, sorry. The other thing Mike had kind of brought up when we were talking about that ruthlessly thing was that was just simply referring to the amount of years that they could keep foreigners for. Uh, it doesn't seem like that's really specifically talking about that one aspect of it. I think it was more all the other things we're encompassing, the idea of forced slavery or forced work slavery. Maybe you can give some of your thoughts on that. But I'm sorry, I totally interrupted you again. I
no,
probably
no,
made you
no,
lose
it's
your thought
fair.
here.
It's good. And I see, I'm like, I can understand for a couple of reasons. I can understand why he sees that, right? So much of this passage is talking about, um, extending the right of redemption and extending, or at a bare minimum, extending this release of the Israelite slaves and treating them well. Um, but it's excuse me. The difficulty comes in verses like 25:53, where it says, like a man hired year by year, he shall be with you. He shall not rule over him with severity in your sight. Given the other contexts, given the way that the Septuagint, for example, translates this word, and I guess that I would use that as a later evidence, but or tertiary evidence, but given how this word perech is used specifically to talk about the forced labor um, that the Israelites served with in Exodus 1, as you see it in Ezekiel, and then given what we consider to be what would have been considered to be the natural um, progress, I suppose, of captives during this period of the conquest, that they would become forced labor, be it corvée labor or conscripted or whatever, not necessarily slaves, but this, the forced labor is involuntary labor. They might be able to go back afterwards and do their regular job or what have you. But um, I I think that it would be difficult to argue um, strictly based on the fact that uh, the release of the slave after a certain period of time and not being released is what is bound up in the term here. The root itself. I mean, if you look at the cognates, right, it means to like grind down. Um, in fact, I actually just pulled out. Um, yeah, to crumble, to crunch, to smash, to damage, savage, cruel. It can have the idea of just injustice, something that's laid crosswise. That's true, but again, it's all bound up in this idea of like it's bad treatment, right?
Yeah.
So, um, the idea that they would inflict forced labor, that they would inflict, that they would beat them as part of their discipline. I mean, these are all things that I think are just bound up in this word perech. Making life difficult through toil. I mean, you think
Yeah.
about what they did. Sorry, and then I'll stop. But you
No,
think
no,
about what they
please.
did. The Egyptians did to them in Exodus 1 when this word is used. That they were giving them all the materials at first to make the bricks, right? But then they took some of the materials away to make it even harder, right? So it's this idea of physical toil, physical labor that they have
Mhm.
to. Yeah. Anyway, so
No,
yeah.
I think too. I think something in which I think you're being very generous with too, uh, and kind of we're trying to give like a little bit of the benefit of the doubt to the Christians, the apologist. You just got to people have got to recognize at the time, like regular slavery was everywhere, right? Like this wasn't like, and this is me, I'm giving more of my opinion, I think, but I think my opinion is backed by probably history. And that's that, like, you can't, it isn't like all of a sudden Israeli culture was this really great culture in the Middle East that was not doing all the terrible things that the people around them were doing, right? Like there's a reason why they have slavery at all. There's a reason why women are property. Women are considered property. There's a reason they're committing genocide, right? They're just as bad, like when I say bad, as we would look at them in modern day terms, as an American, how I would look at a country that would practice such barbaric um, things within their society, right? Remember, like these are the same people that would go in, like in that scripture right there, we had Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 15. When you march and attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept it, open the gates. All the people shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to take peace, engage in battle, lay siege to the city, and basically put the sword to all men in it. Like it tells you, as for the women and children, the livestock, they're bounty for you. So just keep this in perspective. Like what drives me crazy when I debate Christians or apologists with this is like they want to try to always make it like this is no, it was a good society. We really limited, God limited the harshness of what was going on in the cultures around them. But even something that was brought up before we went on air is I was asking, about the Code of Hammurabi, and they had a shorter amount of time slaves would work and then be freed. Was it 4 years is what it was compared to 7 years with the Hebrews, if I'm correct? So sometimes their practices were worse in Israel than some of the cultures around them. But anyways, I just wanted to say my piece with that. I think it's really important people just listen. It was a long time ago. A lot of cultures were committing genocide. A lot of people were doing slavery. It's a weak argument to try to look at the text, and we're being generous by doing this and giving them the opportunity, like the fair deal of looking at the text to try to interpret it and understand, what the rules were and what's going on. As I pointed out during the debate with Mike Winger, if slaves didn't get beat with rods, there's no reason why you would have a mention of like if you kill a slave by beating him with a rod, you're to be punished, right? Obviously, at the time, people were being beat and forced labor, stuff like that. Anyways, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's talk about that for a second, because I think that's actually a point that I was a little confused by. The rod there it's a wooden rod. It's a shavit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you might think that sounds really harsh, beating with a rod, but it's the same rod. I mean, if you went to a Baptist church growing up, you've probably heard "spare the rod, spoil the child." Same word, right? And I'll just read some of the Proverbs about this. So Proverbs 13:24. I just wrote them all out. He who spares his rod, his shavit, hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. I mean, the rod was used as discipline on children, right? Proverbs 22:15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline will remove it far from him. I mean, like, do not 23:13. Do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you beat him with the rod, he will not die. Right, and this is the point, right? So beating with a rod was the commonplace, the common form of discipline for children. So the idea of disciplining your slave with a rod is totally consistent. Proverbs 29:15.
It's not out of the ordinary to think about. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds sort of barbaric to us, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe not if we grew up in the 50s or something, but
yeah.
Go out and get me a branch, to beat you with. I mean, I remember, people tell me about that growing up in the 50s, but
shit, I used to get, my grandmother would make us go get a stick, like a switch. She'd make us go pick it off the tree, like, you get it. Like pick your poison, and like it didn't happen that often, but I'll never forget, like, her being like, "Go get a switch,"
Go get me something to spank you
and that's
with.
when I had to go get a freaking switch to get spanked with.
Come
Terrible.
back with a piece of notebook paper.
Exactly. Well, here it is. Beat me with this, Grandma. See what you can do. No, you're right, and I just don't. It's a lot of it's cognitive dissonance. I don't know if I'm using that term right. It's just they're not willing to accept it, right? And what I think is easier, I don't know why. I don't like if you're willing to go all these ways to kind of redefine terms and be like, oh no, it's a good kind of slavery in the Bible. Just say that part of the Bible wasn't written by God. Like, just give it up. Like, if you just gave it up, that particular section, you'd be fine. You'd be like, no, this probably wasn't God telling Moses to do this. It was probably just the rules of society. They're trying to form a society, trying to make things work, and then Moses gave these rules. But then they have to give up a lot of the Old Testament and what's going on.
Yeah.
It's funny. I didn't even think about that. I just had Googled it when you said start looking. I was like, man, there is a lot of quotes about beating your child with a rod.
Well, here, let me give you
Yeah.
let me give you a couple more.
Yeah.
So Proverbs 29, down in verse 15, it says, "The rod of reproof gives wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother." Well, 4 verses later, it says, "A slave will not be instructed by words," and they supply with a question mark the word "alone," which I think is probably fair. Will not be instructed by words, because he will understand and there will not be an answer. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than him. He who pampers his slave from childhood will in the end find him to be a son. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that this idea of chastising children, of chastising slaves, and doing so with a rod, it's just, I think it's what was common, right? And so then when you come to something like Exodus 21, and it says, if a master beats his slave or his maiden with a rod so that they die, right now the proverb has said, beat him with a rod and he won't die. I mean, the idea is that if he dies from it, you're no longer chastising.
Yeah,
I think
you're
that's the
killing him.
idea.
Exactly right. No, you're right. It's exactly right. That's a good point. Is it really? And Mike was trying to kind of make that point a little bit, but because he was talking that it was more about murder than you killing someone. But at the same time, he was trying to deny that it was okay to beat slaves with rods. But clearly, it was okay to beat your children. I don't see if you can beat your own children, why the slave's going to be any different. Like, that's not your child, and that's a grown person. It seems like you're going to be able to beat them. And once again, I can't think. I'm trying to think of a time in history where people were slaves and there was no physical violence done upon them. Like, I can't think of one culture where you were considered a slave and there was no physical violence ever put towards you or anything like that. I just can't. All right. Treated as a hired servant. I'm trying to think. Do we have anything else we want to talk about when it comes to the hired servants and the debt slavery, all that fun stuff?
I mean, there are some debated passages, but we can get to those later if you want.
Yeah, we'll go. Let's come back to those. Let's go to let's start talking about the foreign slaves a little bit more. So Leviticus 25, 44 for 46 we read. We read Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 15. I see a little note, property we could keep permanently. Maybe want to get into the idea of what property was.
Sure.
And was this traditional property, like you were an object, an item, as far as that goes?
Yeah, it's actually it's actually interesting. Not that this other stuff wasn't interesting, but
yeah.
The word that's used to describe, and I'll go to the verse. Excuse me. I'm really sorry about this.
You're all good. Don't worry about it.
But throughout the chapter, they use this word achuzah, and it's from achaz, to seize something, right? So a seized thing. The Akkadian is it's the same. It's from kashadu, but it's like to anyway. It's not relevant. But it's this. It's the property that you have been allotted. So sorry. So Skylar, let's say you're from the tribe of Judah, and you have been allotted this parcel of land. That's yours, right? It's your achuzah. It is your landed property, right? It is the property of your fathers, right? So when Naomi came back in the book of Ruth, excuse me, from the plains of Moab, she came back to her property, right? It's this was her land. Actually, I don't know if achuzah is used in that passage, but I mean, this is the idea. So when you read through Leviticus 25, and it talks about an Israelite that goes into debt slavery, they're to be released back to their achuzah, their property that is olam. It's their like eternal property, right? It's their perpetual property. And that's the idea behind this land, is that, you know, God was trying to establish this where the land would remain in the family that it was initially given to, right? In the clan that it was initially given to, so that you wouldn't have, for example, the tribe of Benjamin, let's say, becoming really, really wealthy. They get really successful. And I'm not saying that this is the only reason that this would have happened, or the reason that the law was in place, but let's say they get really, they're really successful, and everybody else starts going into debt, and they start buying up all this land, right? Well, now all these, that they've got all this land, and now they're charging all this interest to, did I lose you?
Frozen. Is it me or Josh?
Oh,
I think it's
did I
Josh.
freeze or did you freeze?
No, I think it's. I don't know. I just told the audience to tell me who it froze, but I can't tell. Let's see. You still there?
I think I'm looking at myself on the other screen. I think I was. Oh, yeah. I think I kept moving. Anyway, doesn't matter.
All right, we're good. We're good. We're back on. All right, sorry.
Yeah. So anyway, the point of the passage is that you have this property that is landed, right? It's so every, at the end of 6 years you go back, right? The land has to be able to be redeemed at any time so that it can be bought back and go back to the family. Well, this is the word that's used to describe the foreign slave. So as for verse 44 of Leviticus 25. Well, you there?
Yeah, that's weird. Maybe it's me that's cashing out here. Last thing I heard was you were saying, and that was what's happening. The word was used. That's the way it's happening in the verse here.
Yeah. So in Leviticus 25, 44, by the way, if I was watching it on the other screen in case anybody didn't, like, Skylar dropped out, which is why I kind of stopped talking. You there?
It was weird, yeah, because it cut it. Like I was like, oh no, don't crash. It came back on. Luckily, we're doing all right. We're back, folks.
So it says, as for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then too, it is out of the, and this is that debated word, which we can talk about this if you want, the sons of the sojourners, or the people of the sojourners, who live as aliens among you, that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land, they also may become your achuzah, your landed property, right? It's like your possession. And then it goes on to further specify it. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you. And that's what that word means, to pass them on as inheritance, to receive as a achuzah, le'olam, forever, right? In perpetuity. You can keep them as slaves. You can rule over them. But in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. Now, I would say, just as a side note here, in favor of Mike's argument, in a sense, I think that definitely the release, keeping a slave in perpetuity would be part of ruling over them with severity, right? I think that would be a part of it, but it's not the only thing, right? And I think that's key.
Yeah.
I think that's key to understanding this, that it's not, it would be vastly limiting. The thing that the, excuse me, that the Egyptians did, or that the people in Ezekiel did to the people that were their slaves, was not just that they wouldn't let them go. That's not what the text talks about. It's ruling over with severity. Anyway. So yeah, I don't, this is property that they can keep. They're considered that property in that sense. Now, the false dichotomy, no, the false equivalency. I'm so terrible at these things. The things that Mike said, well, if they're property, it seemed like what he was saying is if they're property, that means they don't have any rights. Well, that's nonsense, right? One, it's a non sequitur to say if you're property in this sense, that you don't have any rights. That's just not true. And none of the ancient Near Eastern texts bear that out. So you can't say that just because a slave is considered property that they don't have any rights. Of course they have rights. It's just that they're limited more than a free person's, right? And as a matter of fact, and you can read any ancient Near Eastern scholar on this, a legal scholar, many of these slaves, even though maybe in theory they were strictly considered property, they could do things very similar to a free person. They could own property. They could go buy and sell. In other words, there were things that they could do that you would not consider a normal slave that is property to be able to do. So anyway, okay, sorry.
No, it's good. No, I think too, when we get into which we'll probably get into next, when we really deal, I think some of the worst forms of slavery, as we talk about, is probably really for the women and what goes on with them, because there's really no choice whatsoever in anything. And we'll read some of those scriptures, but it's interesting, right? Because there is this tendency to be fair. Is when we use words, we have certain images in mind of these words, right? Now, Mike brought up, we talk about slavery, we think about American slavery. But I think it's also fair, is there's a reason why when you look at these words, like we were breaking down the Hebrew, that they're describing some of the aspects of that negative type of slavery. And that when scholars at some point define these words, when they translate them, they did translate to the word slave, right? When you specifically talk about the Hebrews, it's more that indentured servitude, that kind of working for somebody to pay off a debt. But even that, I think, is kind of strange, because I think about why at all use the word slave if this is basically a job, right? To some degree, like if we're just saying someone's poor and you sell yourself to somebody to make a living, basically doing things, whatever that person wants you to do, whether it be farm work or I don't even know what slaves would do back in those times, to be honest with you. Like, why wouldn't we just call that work? Like, why wouldn't we just say, hey, this is just like having another job? You're just working for me, basically. I don't know. Maybe these are questions that we can't answer. But
I think that they do, and I think that's the difficulty. So one of the difficulties in Exodus 21, and this came up in your debate with Mike, was that it was unclear. I think both of you were unclear as to who Exodus 21 is talking about. Is it chattel slavery or is it debt slavery? Mm-hmm. Well, you're not the only ones, right? This is a debate that rages on. And I can recommend Gregory Kirikinyo's book on debt slavery. in Israel and in the wider ancient Near East. I don't necessarily agree with all his conclusions, but he has a really good discussion on the different positions that people take. It's actually quite debated, Exodus 21, and because of the fact that it uses eved, servant, slave, that term that kind of can go one way or another depending on the context. It's unclear. However, in Leviticus 25, it says specifically he's not to be with you as an eved, he's to be with you as a sachir, one that is like a hireling that's paid his wages. So in that case, that is much more like a job, right? Now, what he's saying there is that in reality, he's a debt slave, right? He's there as a debt slave, but you're to treat him better than the position that he's actually
Exactly.
in, right? So but that's not applicable to the foreign slaves, right? And I think that's something that we miss. And I think it's something that if you just go to Deuteronomy chapter 20 and read through the procedure like we did, what's supposed to happen with the foreign peoples, that this is not surprising. It makes a lot more sense in the context, because we would say, well, that's terrible. All of the nations that are there in the land of Canaan, you're supposed to wipe out, right? Whether they did it or not is sort of irrelevant to the discussion.
Yeah.
But and certainly they did it with some cities.
I mean, the Canaanites, the Amalekites.
Yeah, I mean,
so many that they just killed everybody.
But the fact that the text is calling for the haram, this ban over the nations within Canaan, and then to be nice to the other nations that are outside of the land, all you do is subject them to this forced labor, this mas, unless of course they fight against you. Well, then you're supposed to kill all the men, and you take the women, and it doesn't say their sons, the banim, the normal term that we see. It says taf, and taf is like the little ones.
Wow.
So you take them as your plunder, right, as your booty, and we hear that and go, oh my gosh, that's terrible. And again, and you said this earlier, and I think we need to say it again. Neither you nor I are trying to say that within the culture that these things took place, that these things would have been considered immoral or grossly immoral, right? This is how life was. Neither of us are disagreeing with that.
No.
What we're saying is that given their context, so went their morality. That's the point, right? So now
exactly.
When we look at this, we have a different morality, a morality that is, I don't know if we want to say more developed, or I don't know what we want to call it, but it's one that is different, right? It's relative to our cultural period, and I think that's really important to distinguish. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's okay. In the bigger picture, when I'm arguing these things, when you hear me arguing with Christian apologists, it's to make a moral argument against their God, to show that their God is morally contradictory, right? God could have easily just told the Israelites, hey, feed and help your brothers and sisters out, right? God could have made any of those cultures around them that they make human beings go kill a bunch of children in. He could have just made those cultures drop dead so people didn't have to go to war and fight, right? They were going to be eliminated either way. God just chose a methodology in which he would have human beings execute kids and women and then take the virgins, right? So when we argue this, like obviously Josh and I are atheists towards the Christian religion. We don't believe in it. We don't really believe God, or there's a God and he ordered these things. Let me tell you how terrifying it would be if this is actually the case. that this God, God Jehovah existed. It would be terrifying, to be honest with you. What's convenient is I reckon, well, at least what I recognize is that the way God does things in the Bible is the way human beings do things in real life. So rulers tell their armies to go in and execute anybody and take the plunder. A society that has no issue with slavery puts rules and regulations to slavery so people can buy slaves. So I think these are things to keep in mind and remember. And I think this will be a good point. Unless you have something else you need to add to this, we'll start going into some of the women's slavery and some of the stuff that goes on.
Sure.
Do you have anything you want to add before we go on to the next section? Do you feel good so far? I know we had a lot of stuff ready, but
I'm trying to remember. There was something that I wanted to.
Let's take a look at the notes here. I see foreign slaves, war, purchased, birth. You know what? Let me ask you about that. Now, you had mentioned that you can be born into indentured servitude. Is that because your parents basically were in indentured servitude and you were bought into it also, or?
Yes, I mean, we can go back to it in Exodus 21.
It's also funny. I had Exodus 21 up here because I was just reading through the different things. It's funny because you have Exodus 20. It says anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Which like I said, it should, to me, that clearly says you could beat your slave with a rod as long as you don't kill them, because it even clarifies because they're your property. They didn't die. But I think it's also the aspect of that. But I think it's funny because you have verse 20, right? And then you go to and that was 21. Then you go to verse 22, and it's like, if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there's serious injury, you're to take a life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound, and bruise for a bruise, right? And then you go to the next verse, 26, we're back to slavery again. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go for free to compensate for the eye. An owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. I thought it was kind of funny. In between these two slavery passages, we have one about men fighting and injuring a pregnant woman there. I don't know. I just wanted to add that, as I'm reading through, it's been a while since I've read Exodus. Can't wait till we get to this chapter and we do our Bible study thing. But I mean, you have rules for like bulls. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull, will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull had the habit of goring and the owner has been warned, but he not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner is also to be put to death. Some interesting things that would come up in that society.
We should probably continue to read that one because it's actually fairly telling.
Is it? Yeah, okay, yeah.
In verse 31,
yeah.
Whether it gores a son or a daughter, it shall be done to him according to the same rule. If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall give his or her master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox is to be stoned. So if you note, if it kills a man, it's a capital punishment, right? I mean, but if it kills a slave,
just money you owe because they're property. Once again, that's a good. God, I'm glad we read that together. That's pretty interesting. And what was that? What was you said something too that caught my ear. Warn where man supposed to be stoned. The law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. If the bull gores a male or female, no, okay, never mind. Maybe I just misunderstood that. Yeah, I think that's another thing referring to, because the slave's money, it's their property, And why you're not punished like in a criminal thing to die. You're just punished by having to pay some money.
And I mean, I think we need to note that, that the Bible, they're not coming up with this on their own. Excuse me. The laws about ox goring, I can't remember which code it's lifted from. Um, I don't like using the word lifted, but
Mhm.
it's almost pretty good here. This is a common law, right? The ox scoring and the different stipulations. So I I just think it's important to, and the penalties are similar in the other ancient Near Eastern texts. So um, I think it's 15 pieces of silver that the person that owns the ox has to pay, and not 30. But nonetheless, yeah. Sorry.
No, it's good. I'm so glad we caught that, because I mean that it is telling to show you to show people, listen, these people were their money, they were property, they were, that's why, like, why is a slave, if you kill a slave, it's not the same. Why aren't you put to death for killing a slave? But if you were just to kill another human being, you were put to death for. Doesn't make much sense. Okay. Let's go back to that. We were going to get into the women slavery here. We have Exodus, I think one of the ones you listed, Exodus 21, 7 through 9. So let me pull that up real quick. 27, what was it? 27? 21, 7, Exodus 21. Let's see here. All right. You know what? We'll start from the beginning here. I should screen share real quick. Hold on. Let's get this up.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the structure of Exodus 21 is is interesting. There's a pattern to it in the Hebrew that I think lays it out nicely. So if we want to talk about that, we can.
Yeah, we'll do that too. So we'll start at the first verse, Exodus 21. These are the laws you were to set before them. This is God talking, I believe, to Moses here. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. If he goes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. Now look at that right there. If the master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the master shall go free. We need to stop sharing that for just a minute, because I think we need to talk about that before we even move into the next section here.
Yep.
If that isn't clear cut to how messed up the situation is, I wish I would have brought this scripture up to Mike. I really wish. I'm kind of sad that I didn't have that ready. I should have been better prepared for that. But the fact, like, why? First of all, let's just try to let me just, Christians out there, there's your opportunity to write in our chat or the comment section. Tell me why he gets to keep the women and children. Right? You just explain it to me. Explain to me. I would love to know too. I know this woman didn't really have a choice, and I mean, what's the other thing here? What is he gets a woman to marry the slave? Also, like, I'm sure this doesn't have any choice involved for the woman. It's really messed up, and I wonder how long those kids get to get kept for. Right? I wonder if this is going to fall under Hebrew law, or they'll have to be. It doesn't seem like it. It seems weird that you would keep them and then you'd say in 7 years they can go free. Right. And then two, I've heard this also brought up. This is a way also of trapping your male slave, basically, also, because let's be real here. If you give him a wife that he probably cares about and loves, and 2 children or multiple children, probably loves the kids too. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And I tell you what, I probably wouldn't want to leave my wife, who's a slave, and my children, who I guess are slaves too, with with the slave master. Your thoughts so far?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I feel like I cough every time I start to talk. So, I mean, this is the issue, right? So, the situation is you've got a guy that comes in as a debt slave, an Israelite, and while he's working, the master gives him ostensibly a slave, um, and he has kids with that slave. Uh, I suppose. I mean, if you look at other ancient Near Eastern law, you can have a free woman marrying a slave, and there are different regulations for if a free woman marries a slave. But in either case, I would imagine it's a slave, given the rest of it. But when it's time, after the 6 years, it's time for the guy to go out. Uh, you know, the female slave and the offspring are his property, right? They're his, the
Yeah.
master's, right? Not because he allowed the male slave to to be with him, and so, or to be with her, and so, um, this is a monetary issue, right? Hey, I let you procreate with my property, and you can't just you don't get to just take it now. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, I think that's a significant thing to consider. Again, we say that this was absolutely common. This is exactly what happened in the ancient Near East. So nothing special about this, in that sense. So, but yeah, that's what's going on.
Well, and let's read the next verse because I think this is really where it kind of more telling as we keep reading this. And this is verse 5. So, we just finished the master gave him a wife, and she bears sons and daughters. A woman and her children shall belong to her master. Only the men shall go free. Now, verse 5. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then the master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost. I should be screen sharing this. Hold on. Sorry, guys. If I love my master, my wife, children, do not want to go free, then this master shall take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door and doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. I don't know if I can pronounce that right.
You are.
Then he will be his servant for life. So basically, by giving him a wife, and now he has children, if he doesn't want to leave his wife and children, he has to become a servant for life, a slave for life. And then we go to the next one. This is where it really gets to verse 7. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to be freed as male servants do. And of course, this is by depending on the translation. It'll say slave here. It's just depending on which translation you get. If she does not please the master who has selected for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, or marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she shall go free without any payment of money. Which is really, it's still kind of interesting, right? Because even if he doesn't keep his word, he doesn't do things right, the best situation she can get free, and she's not going to get any money for the situation. She's going to be no longer a virgin, which will cause problems, right? I don't even know what I would be interesting to find out what happens if you lose your virginity, if you can get remarried in that culture, how you'll be looked at in that society. I imagine not very well. But once again, there's no rights for the women here. The women aren't choosing. Like, it straight up says he picked her. Then he could decide to sell her to his sons. All kinds of fun stuff in that little verse. So let me read it again. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment or money. Even if he doesn't do the things he's supposed to do. And like, she could be a second wife also, according to the scripture. Polygamy. There you go. So this is obviously part of Israeli culture and Hebrew culture was polygamy. They were marrying more than one person at the time. Otherwise, once again, why would you mention this if you're giving laws to the Hebrews? Things like that. Anyways, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Josh. If you
No.
yeah.
Sorry. I think that looking at how this plays out, I'm just looking back at verse 7. This idea of the head of the household, the husband, the head of the household was, he was the one that was in charge, and so um, it sounds bizarre to us that he could sell his wife, he could sell his children um, into slavery to pay off, a debt. But yet, it's just how it was. And I think that while this, there are other ancient Near Eastern laws that talk about this similar situations. It does seem like this text, at least to some degree, provides a better situation for the woman. And I mean, I don't think there's any problem saying something like that. Not that I've thoroughly researched every aspect of this, but I mean, just thinking back to some of the laws and what a slave owner could do with his slaves as far as selling them. I don't know that I remember the same sorts of restrictions, but nonetheless, I mean, that's what you're describing here. Is the head of the house, the father, being able to sell members of his family into slavery to pay off a debt.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. I mean, and we'll go to another. This is the other big verse. This is the one we actually talked about during our conversation, Mike and I, and that was Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, and this has to do with marrying female captives. So this is basically when I'll just read it. It explains it really. The scripture actually really breaks it down for you, actually, simply enough for us. Verse 10, when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord God is giving them into your hands and you take them captive, and you see among them a beautiful woman and you desire to take her to be your wife and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head, pare her nails, and she shall take off her clothing in which she was captured and shall remain in your house and lament her father and mother for a full month. After that, you may go into her and go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. All right. Once again, clearly a captive. This is use the word captive. This is a woman who's been captured. The Israelites have already killed everybody. This would be one of those situations like earlier we read where you kill all the men and you keep the women, the virgins, and the children for yourself, basically. She's one of those people. She's probably a virgin, I was what I would imagine. Israelite takes a liking to her, is like, hey, I'm gonna keep you. You seem like a good, like it's like a puppy or like a pound. Like, I found the puppy I wanted. This is it. I'm gonna bring you home. We gotta get you neutered first, do a couple little things, and you'll be living with me no matter, really, really soon. So once again, shows you the way that women were treated. They didn't have choice, they didn't have rights, any of these things. It clearly, I think, at the end of that verse talks about how she's humiliated. Depending on the translation, there's a bunch of different words. Humble is the most, I think, the King James version. But he slept. He forced her to marry her, let her mourn her parents for a month, which is no time at all, really, when you think about it. I would say, as audience members, think about could you forgive the soldiers who just executed your whole family, friends, and village within a month, and then marry the guy who just may have killed your best friend or something? I don't think you could. Yeah, I think it's just so much wrongness here, in my opinion. I don't understand how, like, I think Mike at one point, actually during our discussion, I think he understood the uncomfortableness of what was going on here, and there really wasn't much of an argument for it. And I think I don't want to say disingenuous, but I feel like the word might apply in the situation because he seemed to pretend, is what I'm going to use the word, that as if he didn't understand that in that culture, women were sold off or given off. Like it wasn't like a free culture where women, you would court a man and then you'd fall in love and then there's your life with your children and your family. Like that's just not how things were done. You had no rights as a woman. You were property, and then you were most likely sold off or married off in that situation. Anyways, go ahead, Mr. Doc Josh.
Yeah, I mean, their rights were definitely vastly limited in comparison, and I think to talk about this term humbled, it's actually something that's come up several times, and I thought it would be a good idea to sort of lay it out what it means. And I think the best way to do that is to just go through some of the uses. So it's actually a little tricky. It's bad. There's no question about it. It's not, it's used in rape contexts several times, and we can go to some of these passages if you want. So Genesis 34.
Genesis 34, yeah.
Verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her and lay with her by force. That word by force is and oppressed her and humbled her.
Same word they use in that verse. Yeah.
Now that doesn't necessarily, well, we'll just read some more and then we'll talk about it. So 2 Samuel 13.
2 Samuel and Samuel's where all the really good stuff tends to happen.
Yeah.
2 Samuel, what was it?
13.
Okay.
And I'll start in verse 10. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat from your hand. So Tamar took the cakes which she had made and brought them into the bedroom to her brother Amnon. When she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come, lie with me, my sister. But she answered him, no, my brother, do not violate me. It's the word, ana in the PL. Do not humble me. For such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And of course, if you go down to verse 14, however, he would not listen to her since he was stronger than she. He violated her and lay with her. I mean, we can read other passages like this, but this isn't the only way that this verb is used, but it's used in this context of non-consensual sex. Now, it's not only used in those contexts. It can be used in a situation of consensual sex. So Deuteronomy, where did I go? 22:24. I know this is probably a little tedious for everybody, but 23. So if there is a girl who is a virgin engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death. The girl, because she did not cry out in the city, and the man, because he has violated, there's that word, his neighbor's wife. So it's very likely that this is consensual, or at least it was considered consensual by the law itself, because if she was in the city and he raped her, she would have cried out. And I think that's the point of the text. But so anyway, the meaning of the word has to do with, what would we say? There's a Seinfeld episode where Jerry's goes to the dentist and thinks that while he's under the gas, that the dentist and his assistant have like done sexual things to him. And he says, "I'm damaged goods now." And Elaine says, "Join the club." And that's what I think of when I think of this verb, right? It's oftentimes it's a sexual thing that you've oftentimes with rape by force, non-consensual. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, but the point is that it's violating and damaging and ruining. It's like, as you were talking about with virginity,
Mhm.
it's you're damaged goods now. And that often is in the context of forced sex. So you can't hang like we wouldn't be able to hang the word rape on ana here. It's in the PL. It's often in the context of rape.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily, but as you said, I think very aptly, the context is clearly, and Mike admitted to that, clearly sex without consent, right?
Yeah.
And by our definitions, that is rape.
I mean, yeah, everything in the context of it leads you to believe that's why it's saying this is how you. Oh, it's just, I don't even have the right verse up anymore. That this is, how do I say that? Yeah, I think by looking at the context of it, what you're saying, we have an army coming in, killing everybody. The woman, it's saying not, it understands the situation that the woman isn't very happy in this situation is what I think. And if you lose your liking to her as a man, like, yeah, that I think when you look at that word humiliated, what's the Hebrew word again? Anah?
It's ana, but it's in the PL. It's in the that doesn't mean anything to you guys. Yeah, it's ana.
Yeah, it's close enough. Good deal. I think within context wise, I think it's safe to say that's what's going on here. But I mean, this is just a historical thing. Women just were sold off by their parents. I mean, you could literally. This is this is what the other scripture was with the woman. Just their parents went into debt. What scripture was that? That was
Yeah, that's Exodus 21.
Exodus 21, where if her parents are poor, they need to make some money, sell their daughter off. And we talked a little bit about that with Mike also. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that's what was going on. But once again, and I'm going to highlight this real quick again. The reason we're bringing up well, that's what I guess for me in these particular arguments, I should speak for myself. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm usually talking to people who believe the Bible is God's infallible word, right? So being able to show somebody that this is where God tells people that this is how you have to regulate your daughters. This is how you sell your daughters into slavery. This is where I tell you to kill lots of people, commit genocide, and take the virgins. These are inconsistencies in a moral character, and according to their own standard, right? Because I'm not just saying what my moral idea of goodness. A lot of times, that's the frustrating part. Is I find Christians aren't willing to admit that some of the stuff that's going on here is just good old-fashioned slavery, good old-fashioned beating people, killing people. It isn't just it isn't some kind of magic that's happening. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a little tired. I'm getting a little out of it. What else we want? Okay, how long have we been going? We've been going about an hour and a half, debating if we should do this in another section. But do you have any other key things we want to cover? Make sure we get covered tonight.
Let me just look through my outline here.
I see stuff with like foreign slave versus local slave. I think we kind of got an idea of that. Male and female slaves are released. We got into that.
So we talked about that there was quite a bit that came up in the beginning about Leviticus 25:45, where the question came up when it says the sons of the inhabitants, the children of the inhabitants, and that he's saying that it's not the little kids going into slavery. And it was a little interesting. It was interesting to me because I remember in the after show, I hadn't really considered that that specific thing. So I'm reading the Hebrew as we're talking, and it was like, okay, well, I mean, it's ambiguous. I mean, it could be, but it could be really either way.
Mhm.
I think that probably after looking at this, so the word, okay, so a couple of things. First of all, I will say that I think he's right in
Mhm.
this particular verse that this is probably talking about um, uh, the word banim here is being used in the sense of like members of a group.
Yeah.
Um, he's wrong, and I think he would probably say that he admits that he would admit this, that just because the word banim is used doesn't mean that it's always bnei Yisrael, like the children of Israel, the children of Ammon. It very often does mean children. But because I mean, even in this passage, but what I thought was interesting was that you it's a weird thing to pick on about the translation, because we have very clear examples of children being plunder, children,
Yeah.
at least the sons, like the actual kids, people that aren't men, going into debt slavery, for example. We don't have to go to these, but um,
Yeah.
in
Yeah. There's plenty of examples of children being slaves, basically, whether it's indentured servitude or the captives uh, in those other stories.
yeah, so in I think it's in Second Kings where I can't remember the verse, but where Elijah, maybe it's in First Kings. Um, I don't remember, but
With the
Elijah,
bears killing a bunch of kids.
you know, the oil. Um, heard here. Let me just find it real quick.
Yeah, and just so audience, if you're just to make so there's a part depending on how you what interpretation you have. This is the thing is like so some interpretations of Leviticus 25 will say you may let's see, let me read this. So I don't know which interpretation I have here. You have where you may purchase male and female slaves from among the foreigners who live among you. You may also purchase the children of such resident foreigners, including those who have been born in your land. So depending on your translation, we kind of got into disagreement whether it's talking about literal children or like the descendants, basically, of these people. And I think you're right. I gave Mike that point when we were in the conversation. I told him, hey, I'll let that. It's fine. We'll say that this isn't specifically referring to literal children, because I didn't really think I needed to keep that in there or to make a strong argument against it. But you're right. I didn't even think about that aspect. It's just like, well, there's plenty of other examples of kids being slaves in here.
Yeah, so
That
like
yeah, it's
Second Kings 4:1. This is the story about Elisha, and it says, "Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord. And the creditor has come to take my two children, my yeladim, that's kids, to be his slaves.'" I
pretty
mean,
clear. Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, it's a creditor, right? And so, of course, the story goes on to talk about how Elisha creates, like, performs a miracle, and she gets all this oil, and so she can sell it, and and buy, pay off the creditor. You also see this in, I think, Nehemiah, where you have people that are children that are being sold to creditors. But the point is that this is not. It's strange to me um, to really harp on that point, because in reality you don't. Yeah, Nehemiah 5. Here are my notes. Nehemiah 5:5. I'll just read that real quick. Um, and now our flesh is like the flesh of our brothers, our children like their children. Yet behold, we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters are forced into bondage already, and we are helpless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. I mean, In other words, and as I pointed out in Deuteronomy 20:14, it uses the word tough there to talk about the little ones, the small children are taken as plunder, as booty. And so, I think it's, if Leviticus 25:45 doesn't mean children there, that's okay. I mean, if it just means members of the residents, that's fine. But it also says, and of their families. So, their mishpachot. So, yeah, I mean, that's not the only place that talks about kids being slaves.
Well, and you look at that, like the creditors are coming for their kids, right? That's just the culture. The culture of what's going on is that, like, hey, if the parents can't pay the debt or they're dead or something, hey, kids are fucking free range. You can take them.
Yep.
Like, that's perfectly moral and good in that culture. So I think that's a really, really good point to actually make. Yeah. All right. I guess we should take some. We'll see if there's any questions from the audience, and then we'll decide. We could always do a second episode with this. We can go an hour and a half. I think I don't want to we put a lot of information out, and I think you're not feeling well. I'm not feeling like great either. So, audience, do you have any questions for us before we end this slavery episode? This gives me an excuse to make a slavery episode 2 these days. But anyways, audience, if you guys have any questions for Dr. Josh, I'm sure they're not for me. If you have any questions for Dr. Josh, you should let us know. We'll do that, and I'll try to get them out here.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that the chat isn't blowing up with.
We don't have a lot of the trolls in here tonight.
Yeah, but we have
something else on.
People watching, which is awesome.
Yeah, we got a good amount of people. Wonder if there's somebody, who never got back to me was Red Pill Religion. I could message them. Like they cancel it once and like, oh, we screwed up, got the dates wrong, and then they're like, okay, we're gonna do this, and then they never got back to me. So I gotta get back to them. I'm supposed to be going on their channel. Let's see here. Modern Day Hysteria is doing a video tonight. If you guys haven't checked, I like Modern Day Hysteria actually a lot. He's a cool dude, Christian dude. He hosts a lot of debates on his channel. And he's got something going on tonight. I think it's about evolutionism. I have a feeling, depending on the people who are, or the people I at least see in there. Someone asked how Megan's feeling, Dr. Josh.
Better. Excuse me. Yeah, she's feeling better. Her voice is still a little hoarse, but better than she's through the cycle. I'm halfway through it. So
wow. All right. Sam Weir asks, were children sold off to pay debts subject to the 6-year release rule?
Yes. Hebrew slaves, yeah.
Hebrew slaves. Foreign slaves, no.
And we'll talk about this in the next, I guess, in the next episode. But there's debate about some of the specifics about who goes out and who doesn't go out. But yes, children that are sold off, they are released back to their families.
What's interesting is I would think about like would there be kids that were too young they wouldn't even want to take a slave? Because it's kind of be pointless to a sense, right? Like if you took a child slave, it's 4 years old roughly. We'll just throw a number out, right? Like you'd have to release them by the time they're like 10 or 11, basically.
Yeah, I mean we so we have evidence from other ancient Near Eastern texts where like infants, even though they're considered the property and they're alienable and they could be sold, they're generally not.
Mm-hmm.
They stay with the mother, and when the mother is sold, the baby goes with it. But I remember when I was in Syria, the people from the village were the ones that were doing the excavation. The village right next to the tell, and it was a 5-year-old out there with a cigarette in his mouth and a shovel in his hand. So
it's mind blowing. That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean,
5 years old is like
it's funny. They're just dangling off, and he's shoveling dirt.
God, it's so sad. All right, yeah, that's pretty crazy. I can't even think about it. It depresses me. Like I think about like situations where I see kids and I'm like, oh, I hope that never happens to my kids, or I always pronounce the name wrong. Jupiter, the True Zoo. So, are there any Sumerian texts that mention Israel or the Hebrews?
Sumerian texts. No, not that I know of. The Merneptah Stele is the earliest text that I know of that talks about the Israelites. It's like 1220 maybe. That's an Egyptian text. Of course, by that point, Sumerian was a quite the dead language, but it was used to transmit ritual and literary texts, liturgical texts. But those tended to stay the same. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of new information being generated with Sumerian.
So, Vlad Tepis, Dr. Josh, could you comment? I'm going to read the scripture. I already pulled it up on 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 20 to 22. It harkens back to Leviticus 25, in that you could make slaves of the children of Israel only of others. So let me read that out real quick. Yeah, I might screen share. Kings chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. There were still people left from the Amorites, the Hittites, the Peretzites, the Hivites, I can never pronounce all these names, Jebusites.
Mm-hmm.
These people were not Israelites. Solomon conscripted the descendants of all these people remaining in the land, whom the Israelites could not exterminate, to serve as slave labor, as it is today. But Solomon did not make slaves of any of the Israelites. They were his fighting men, his government officials, his officers, his captains, and the commanders of his chariots and charioteers. This is interesting. I don't think I've seen this scripture before. So this is basically referring to all the civilizations that the Israelites tried to wipe out through killing them all, but there were people left over, and they were treated as basically slaves.
Yeah. So this is that word that we saw in Deuteronomy in chapter 20, where it says, if you approach the the city and you knock on the gate and say, do you surrender? And they say yes. You go, woohoo, we get to treat you well. You become our corvée labor, right? You're our mas. You serve avad with mas or as mas, and that's what's going on here. So lamas oved is this corvée labor, this forced labor. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a great verse to point out. It's I think a fair description of what the law was stating. So
more slavery. All right, I think that's it, Josh. I think we've done enough for tonight. We have tried hard to put some information out there for you folks in an entertaining way that you can use in the real world. Probably not really. You can't use this in the real world. Maybe if you were in some kind of scholarly discussion or debating one of your friends. Yeah. Anyways, I'm tired. Josh is not feeling well. I've been up since fucking balls early, and I'm done with this for the day. I will say, make sure you check out Digital Hammurabi, Dr. Josh and his wife Megan's channel. There's a link in the description. Subscribe to it. Thank you guys so much for watching tonight. We really appreciate it. Forgive us if we've not given the best performance. Josh did fine. I'm worried more about myself. What else do I want to say? Oh, I have I don't know if it's called a debate conversation. Hold on. Let me get the person's name because I always forget her name.
S.J. Thompson?
S.J. Thompson, yes. So it's going to be during the day on December 5th at 2 p.m. And we're going to be discussing, is Christianity healthy? So I made sure that includes mental health also. So that's happening. I let her choose the topic. So should be fun. 2 to 4 o'clock. We'll check it out on my channel. I don't know what else. We got some other stuff coming up here soon, but we're working on it. I think that's it. Josh, you have anything else you want to add before we go off there? Anything you want to promote?
Yeah,
anything happen soon?
Got a couple of things in the works, By the way, thank you very much, Skylar, for having me on again and for doing this. I've enjoyed doing the research for this, and it's been enlightening.
Tons
And
of research. Thank you, by the way.
no, I've really enjoyed it, and had that. I've been talking to Aaron Ra a little bit, and we may do a video on the book of Daniel and the prophecies in the book of Daniel, talking about the dating of the book. So that, yeah, I don't, it's not firm yet or anything, but we're just toying with the idea. But I'm really excited about the potential of doing something else. Anything else with Aaron is very exciting. So, but yeah, just please, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, I'm sure most of you have, but please do so. And if just to make Megan happy, I mentioned the t-shirts again on Teespring.
Yeah.
I'm going to get lots of good points here for mentioning this. You can go to our channel, I think, and the links are in the whatever. I don't know where they are, but they're somewhere.
Yeah, I think I could grab a link and put that in the description too of your of the t-shirt thing.
But that is, I'll tell you, that Ezekiel 26 video is it seems like it's being used by people a lot. I went to Twitter and searched on Ezekiel 26 because I just wanted to, see what people were saying about the prophecy. And like that video that we did is up several different places, which is really cool. So I'm glad that it's useful to everybody.
No, I agree. It's a great. I mean, it's good stuff. It's a really good video, actually. All right, guys. Like, subscribe, share, all that fun stuff. That's how we get more. We get more interesting guests on the show. You like to see me debate people and have conversations. It's the only way. I got to grow my channel, guys. Been doing this 5 years. I really want to hit that 5,000 mark. I feel like it's soon. It's going to happen. I feel like you guys are going to help me out with it. All right, guys. Till next time, please subscribe and make the world a better place.